It was one of the deadliest operations of the Israeli regime forces in years. Some have called it a massacre. At least 10 Palestinians killed, more than 100 injured in a raid in Nablus. Israeli raids in the occupied West Bank have become more frequent, especially since this far-right cabinet has come to power. Is this due to the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, whose previous times in power have been marred by violence and Palestinian deaths? Or is this part of what has been called the continual, systematic ethnic cleansing of Palestinians? First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Mukhaber Abasada is a lecturer at Al-Azhar University at Gaza City. Joe Catron also joins us. He's the U.S. coordinator at Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, who joins us from New York. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Mukhaber Abasada, I'll first start with you. Taking a look at what has happened in Nablus, it has been now categorized as really a massacre in terms of the raid itself, where 10 so far have been reported to have been killed, and you have over 100 injured. And based on the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, which you're probably aware of this particular part of the report on the number of injured, where it's over 100, and many of them have suffered more than one gunshot wound. What does that tell you about this raid, first of all? I guess first I want to get your reaction on what has happened.
According to Israeli sources, is that Israel went into the old city of Nablus to try to arrest some Palestinian activists who belong to the Nablus brigade, who are fighting the Israeli occupation and fighting Israeli settlers. And according to Palestinian sources, that Israeli security and Israeli military men were disguised in a civilian uniform, trying to infiltrate the old city of Nablus, where they tried to arrest those Palestinian activists, and they surrounded the Palestinian home where those Palestinian activists were being, and they started bombing the house with anti-tank missiles and firing live ammunition at the Palestinians who were hiding in that old city house in Nablus. At the end of the day, as you just reported, more than 10 Palestinians were killed, including 2 elderly Palestinians. One is 72 and another person is 61. In addition to that, 2 Palestinian teenagers were also killed in this Israeli operation. More than 100 Palestinians were injured. About 7 of them have been injured with serious wounds that some of them might not even make it because of the live ammunition that was used by Israeli armed forces. And as a result of that, what we have seen today in the city of Nablus is a Palestinian uprising, a Palestinian intifada, or a former Palestinian intifada against the Israeli infiltrating forces in the old city of Nablus.
Okay.
Now, the way we can describe it, this is an appalling Israeli massacre, or a new Israeli massacre against the Palestinians. Since the beginning of this year, more than 60 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli military occupation forces, and hundreds also have been injured. And unfortunately, this comes after a deal lately at the UN Security Council, where the Palestinians withdrew a decision on which was presented by the Security Council in exchange for a de-escalation by the Israeli armed forces. But what we have seen today is that Israel has basically betrayed its own pledges to the UN Security Council and to
Sure.
the international community to de-escalate its aggression against the Palestinian people.
Joe Catron, what we need to break down here with you, because I think it's very necessary to do this, and that is the fact that we're looking at what Israel calls suspected militants, okay? When we take a look at that term as the reason for the raid to have occurred, the Israeli army has proceeded with that intention to seek out ones or Palestinians who it seems or deems to be, in their eyes, suspected militants. So let's draw out the scenario. You're an Israeli security force member, you're inside your armored vehicle, and you go into Nablus. How do you differentiate, first of all, who is against you and who's not, when presumably everybody that's out there on the street is against the Israeli forces? And this is not the first time that this has happened. So that's one side of the coin. And then the other is the term suspected militants. How do you go and you kill people who you think may have either committed a crime against Israel or settlers or what have you, or may do so in the future when they haven't committed the crime in the first place?
Well, I think in both cases, you're talking about long-standing patterns of Israeli behavior. We know that Israel ultimately makes very little effort to distinguish. In the process of killing one target, they will think very little of killing a dozen other people along with them because they happen to be in the same place or in the same building. This is something we've seen repeatedly in the Gaza Strip, even more than in the West Bank. Additionally, they use targeted assassinations. They simply do not hesitate to kill anyone they see as a fighter with impunity, with no trial, no legal process, no real evidence. Although in many cases, we should be clear, these are actual fighters, some of them who have taken up arms in resistance to the occupation, as they're absolutely entitled to do. The numbers I saw going around just before I jumped on this call were that 2 of the 10 Palestinians killed in Nablus this morning had been, in fact, resistance fighters, while the others were civilians. If we want, that's not the best word to use. Of course, there's a sense in which they're all civilians. But we are dealing with an actual resistance, which Israel is doing everything in its power to suppress. For various complicated reasons, parts of the West Bank in Jenin and Nablus and elsewhere are simply spinning out of its control, as well as out of the control of the Palestinian Authority, which we often see reinforcing Israel's attempts to rule. And they're doing everything they're capable of to suppress this new resistance, which we haven't really seen in the West Bank on this scale since the Second Intifada 2 decades ago. And of course, they're willing to commit any atrocity to accomplish their aims.
Sure. Mohammed Sada, we are looking at the death toll that happened today to equal what happened recently at the Jenin refugee camp, which was a raid that happened last month with the same intentions, with the same motives. And that was deemed at that point one of the deadliest operations since the year 2005. Now, why are we looking at these raids to turn this deadly? Maybe we can stomach the fact that Israel continues with targeting Palestinians, but you know, the raid last month, then what happened today, and again, what pointing to a deadlier future for Palestinians. Is it because of this far-right Israeli cabinet that has come into power, headed by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu?
That is a very good question. But let me say that Israeli massacres against the Palestinian people did not just start with the coming of this new extreme right-wing government led by Netanyahu, which came at the end of the year 2022. Israeli massacres have been going on against the Palestinian people for more than 75 years, starting from the Nakba in 1948, where Israel expelled more than 2/3 of the Palestinian people from their own homes, from their own villages and their own towns into the neighboring Arab countries. And over the past 75 years, more than 50 Israeli massacres have been done against the Palestinian people from, as I mentioned, from Deir Yassin in 1948 all the way until now. Now, it's also true that what happened today in the city of Nablus very much resembles what happened in the city of Jenin just a month ago, where about 10 Palestinians were also killed by the Israeli occupation forces, and Israel is all the time trying to basically justify what they are doing, that they are trying after, or they are going after Palestinian activists who, in legally speaking, are fighting the Israeli occupation and apartheid regime that exists on the Palestinian occupied territory. Let me also say one more thing, that the year of 2022, where it was a different Israeli government, a government by the left and center left, more than 170 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank, and around 50 Palestinians were killed in the Gaza Strip. Overall, more than 220 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli armed forces in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza in the year 22, which was more than any other year since the year of 2005. So it's not only the current Israeli government or the right-wing Israeli government led by Netanyahu who is engaging in massacres and killing and extrajudicial killing against the Palestinians. All Israeli government, left, right, center, whatever you call it, they have been basically committed massacres and committed aggression against the Palestinian people for many years. And unfortunately, this new massacre that happened today in Nablus just comes after a week where the UN Security Council was debating a Security Council resolution to condemn Israeli settlement expansion or condemn Israeli legalization of illegal outposts in the West Bank. What we are seeing is, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many international organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and even the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, they all have basically categorized Israel as an occupation and an apartheid regime against the Palestinian people, which commits massacres and aggression against the Palestinian people without international protection. Sure. And that's why it's the responsibility of the UN, it's the responsibility of the international community to provide protection for the Palestinian civilian population from these Israeli atrocities.
Okay, I really, Joe Catron, I don't know if you agree, we could talk about what our guest there said regarding the UN, where it didn't issue a resolution against Israel, but rather went down for a watered down, I guess, statement condemning Israel for its planned settlement expansion. But when you talk about an organization like the UN, when it comes to Palestinians and the way that Israel has violated or not listened to all these resolutions that has been issued against it, we can see that there is no regard for the UN, and in turn the UN has not really done much for Palestinians. So I'm going to put that conversation to the side and ask you about the most recent visit of the US, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, visiting the occupied territories I guess he was there to try to calm the situation down. But we're seeing, since he left, that actually the violence has increased somewhat. And then we're looking at what has happened today. So what do you make of that, the fact that that visit did not smooth things out? And in particular, when you have such far-right extremist members like Itamar Gavir, who basically has said that anybody rejecting Israel should be deemed a terrorist and in turn then executed.
Well, I think that Blinken's visit and his declared goals were unlikely to achieve much in the aftermath of a new Israeli government. Remember, Israeli political parties and governing coalitions compete with each other on the basis of their brutality against Palestinians. Each wants to accomplish at least as many atrocities as the last government, because that's how much of the Israeli public evaluates them. At the same time, we all know, regrettably, that the United States is unconditional in its support for Israel and its crimes. Our president, Joe Biden, has said multiple times that if there were no Israel, the United States would have to invent one to advance its interests in the region. So these U.S. attempts have to be seen in the context of the U.S. ultimately trying to advance its shared goals with Israel, perhaps through slightly different strategies. They might prefer that we didn't see these repeated atrocities making it onto the front pages of the newspaper quite as much. But at the end of the day, they're on the same page. They're trying to achieve the same things, particularly in the region, more so than in Palestine. They share common enemies, and the United States sees Israel as a very useful asset in the area to achieve its own goals. And that's why the United States is also ironclad in its support for Israel in the United Nations, not only blocking movement in the Security Council, as we've seen more times than I would care to count, but also using its funding of UN agencies, which is oversized, along with the funding from other Western powers, which are favorable to Israel, and its influence on various member states to prevent any real action against Israeli atrocities.
Let's take a look at Mukhaber Abu-Sada, the group that has been mentioned to have its birthplace in Nablus, and that is a group by the name of the Lion's Den, which is amongst a number of groups that are basically homegrown Palestinians who have formed these groups in order to obviously stand up against Israel. We know that this happened after in March of 2022, based on what we have, where you had 19 Palestinians, you had a number of Palestinians forming this group because of the raids that happened in Nablus. And they're not affiliated to any of the common resistance groups that are out there, based at least on the records that we have. Are we looking at this being a real threat for Israel, which is why they've been targeted, for example, not only in Jenin but in Nablus?
What we see in the Palestinian occupied territories is a new phenomena where a group of young Palestinians who have grown sick of the Israeli occupation, who have grown sick of Israeli aggression and Israeli atrocities against the Palestinian people, and also a lack of protection from the international community, as we just spoke, and also the inability of the Palestinian Authority to provide security for its own people, who is coordinating on the security level with the Israeli occupation forces. All of these reasons have pushed a number of Palestinian youth, where in the city of Nablus, where they have established the Lion's Den, or in the city of Jenin, where they have established the Jenin Brigade. And basically these brigades, whether the Jenin Brigade or the Lion Dens, they are Palestinian youth between the age of 18 and 23 who are dedicated to fighting the Israeli occupation, who are dedicated to fighting Israeli settler violence in the Palestinian occupied West Bank. And what we have been witnessing lately is Israel continue to raid these cities, whether the city of Jenin or the city of Nablus, to try to finish or to try to put an end to this new phenomena that is growing in the Palestinian occupied territories, which also they are trying to fill the vacuum where the Palestinian resistance groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other Palestinian groups have been, to some extent, have been deterred by the Israeli attacks against them, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, to carry out attacks against Israel. So we have seen a number of Palestinian youth who are organized in the Lion's Den or the Jenin Brigade, who are fighting the Israeli occupation. And also we have seen a new phenomena lately in the Palestinian territories, which is described by Israel as the lone wolf operation, where individual Palestinians take things onto their own hands by going after Israeli army posts or Israeli settlers to try to defend themselves and defend their villages from Israeli settler attacks. So what we, in general, what I can tell you is that as a result of the Israeli continued aggression, as a result of the Israeli atrocities against the Palestinian people, which have been going on for 75 years now, the Palestinians have decided that they have to defend themselves. They have to fight back.
Sure.
They have to protect their own people, and they have to protect their own land from this Israeli aggression. And this is what we are basically seeing in different areas of the West Bank, whether Jenin, Nablus, and sometimes we also see the same model in the city of Hebron or the city of Beit Lahem also.
Okay. Well, since we're quickly running out of time here, Joe Catron, tell us the different dynamics that are involved here and whether this is going to lead to something that is it should be a threat to Israel. You're looking at the one hand, what we just discussed with our other guests in Gaza City, about these groups that are homegrown, forming themselves, that don't have any real affiliation to the common resistance groups. That's on the one hand. Then you have the resistance groups that are well known, like the Islamic Jihad, like Hamas. On the other hand, you have Israel that's dealing with a domestic crisis. You have Israelis that have come out in full force for over 2 months against Netanyahu and his extremist cabinet. And then you have another factor like Israelis migrating out of Israel, and some that's been speeded up because of the fact that they want to show in protest that they're against this cabinet. Are we looking at all these different factors contributing to be a real threat for Israel, given the fact that there's this notion out there that after 80 years, Israel will cease to exist?
I certainly think we're looking at some very real threats for Israel. The regime itself obviously sees the renewed resistance in the West Bank as a viable threat, which is why it's been responding with such ferocity. It's also contributing in a way, I think, to Israel's internal crisis, which you mentioned, the fact that they can't seem to keep a government in office for more than a year, and there's essentially no political consensus to be found among Israelis, except in brutality against Palestinians. That's their one common denominator, and it's the reason why successive Israeli governments make it such a point to commit brutality, because they know this is the one thing that will bring different political forces together, while in the absence of a common enemy, we would probably be instead discussing an Israeli civil war.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you. Joe Catron, U.S. Coordinator, Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, Mukhaber Abu Sada, lecturer at the Al-Azhar University from Gaza City. Thank you to you both. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Mikava Tavai and the team, it's goodbye.